Okay, welcome. Hi, I'm Christina. I am with the Fort Bend County Libraries, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming to our event, Texas Talks, the Texas Convict Lease System. And we have today Dr. Theresa Jach. Is that the correct pronunciation?
It's Jack, yes.
Oh, Jack. Okay, my apologies. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, so I am Dr. Theresa Jach, and I am a history professor at Houston Community College in Katy. I study convict leasing and prison systems in Texas, and I've been involved with the City of Sugar Land task force on the Sugar Land 95, and also I'm on the Fort Bend ISD advisory board on the Sugar Land 95. So, and we'll talk a little bit more. I thought maybe in questions or at the end, I'll talk a little bit more about what's going on with the Sugar Land 95. But I want to give you today just a little bit of background on convict leasing and prison farms in Fort Bend County, because this is really at the center of what was going on then. So just basically, I'm going to share my PowerPoint. So basically, convict leasing is renting out prisoners for their labor. And this is going to happen after the Civil War, and it will not end until 1912. And basically what they're doing is that in Texas and all across the South, they have many issues that this actually addresses. First of all, white landowners want workers that they can force to labor in agriculture like they had under slavery. Second, the prison up in Huntsville was very old, small, falling apart, and it's not big enough to hold all of the people that are being sent to the prisons after the Civil War. And third, and probably really important for Texas, is they didn't have a lot of money at the end of the war. They don't have money to update the prison. They don't have money to handle all of the new inmates that are coming in. So this is, if I can figure out how to turn it. There we go. This is the Huntsville Penitentiary. It was built in 1849. This photograph is from about 1866, so right after the Civil War. And you can see that there are inmates inside the walls there. That's in the courtyard. And when it was built originally, it was designed to hold just white prisoners because enslaved people were punished on the plantation. They rarely made it into the formal criminal justice system while they were enslaved. And that means after the Civil War, we have a whole group of people that are now subjected to the criminal justice system. And there's going to be a dramatic increase in the number of arrests and convictions of African Americans. And they are targeted. There are newly created laws that are put into place that are designed to control the labor of former slaves. So for example, there's a vagrancy statute in Texas that makes it illegal to not have a job. And for African American men and women, their job had to be working for a white landowner in agricultural labor. And if they weren't, they could be arrested for vagrancy. And other ridiculous laws that could get people arrested: speaking loudly in front of a white woman, walking on railroad tracks. Another example is that in downtown Houston, there were a group of Black men that were selling smoked meat on push carts downtown, and white restaurant owners didn't like that. And so the Houston City Council passed a law making that illegal, and all of those men were arrested for vagrancy. And if you get arrested for vagrancy, there's pretty steep consequences. You're fined, and it's a big fine. And if you can't pay it, which if you don't have a job, you can't pay a fine, you would get auctioned off to the highest bidder who would pay your fine. And then you worked for them for free until your fine and all interest was paid off. So it's very dramatic, the vagrancy statutes. Other examples of crimes that are sending Black Texans to the penitentiary. And also, there are children as young as 10 years old up in prison, and they're housed with adults during this period. So for example, one man was sentenced to 2 years in prison for stealing 5 cents. Another 2 years in prison for taking half a plug of tobacco. One man got 7 years for taking an orange. And another man is actually convicted of theft, and all he did was take some wool out of the garbage, out of the trash, and he made a pair of socks from it, and he was charged with theft and sent to prison. So in Texas, and really across the South, there is no money to maintain those penitentiaries, let alone repair them. And so states start experimenting with what to do with all of these new inmates that they have. And so they think about like public works, working on roads. So this is an image of a chain gang in North Carolina, and they're being held in these railroad carts, housed in them, and they're working on a chain gang in North Carolina. And then we have, this is a chain gang in Alabama working on a road. So the idea is that convicts are going to be doing something for public works, but that's not enough to utilize all the labor that the state suddenly finds on their hands. So Texas began with convict leasing in 1867, but there's a lot of question about whether they can actually do it, whether it's legal or not. And then we have a court case that's going to come out in 1871. It's in Virginia, in the Supreme Court in Virginia, and it is the case of Ruffin v. Commonwealth. So the Supreme Court in Virginia, what's happening here is there's a convict named Woody Ruffin. He's out on a chain gang, and he gets in a fight with another convict, and he kills him. And then the prison holds a trial and convicts him and sentences him to death. And he appeals because he said he should be tried in the jurisdiction where the crime was committed, not by the prison, right? So he's trying to get a new trial that way. And what the court decides in this case is going to have a really profound impact on convict leasing all across the South. Because what they decide is that during his term of service in the penitentiary, a prisoner is in a state of penal servitude to the state. He is, for the time being, the slave of the state. And so when they make this ruling, basically they're saying that prisoners are what they call civilly dead, meaning they don't have any rights and they can use them for whatever they want. And once this ruling comes out, all across the South, Texas included, you'll start to see convict leasing expanding dramatically. So 1871, right after this ruling, the Texas legislature is going to lease out the entire prison system to a Galveston area group called Ward, Dewey and Company. Now, Andrew, or A.J. Ward as he was called, he had been in charge of the penitentiary in Arkansas, but he actually ran off. Union troops were coming into Arkansas to the prison, and he took off and came to Texas. And so this company is going to get to start with a 15-year lease. It's going to be, they pay $5,000 a year for the first 5 years, and then it goes up to $10,000 a year, and then by the last 5, it's $20,000 a year into the state. And then they're supposed to take care of the prison. Now, they also get to use prisoners for whatever they want. They use many of them on their own plantations, and then they lease others to other area planters. But it provides a lot of money into the state, and they don't have the expense of operating the prison. They make so much money, but there's also a lot of abuse. And so they're going to lose their lease because of that. So we'll talk a little bit about that, the abuses that were going on there. There's an investigation by the Texas legislature in 1875, and they find just all kinds of shocking things. But what really got people upset was there were a group of white military prisoners in Huntsville, and they get transferred to the federal penitentiary in Kansas. And when they get there, they tell stories about being beaten and abused. They're half starved. Some of them die shortly after arriving. And this is actually going to make national news. It's going to be quite shameful for Texas. And so they're going to investigate the prison. And they find that several men had been killed in the stocks. meaning they get choked to death in the stocks. One man, he had less than 17 days left on his sentence, and he gets killed by having his neck broken. So I'll show you an image. This is from Delaware, and it shows a whipping post and stock. In Texas, the stocks were designed so that you stood up on your tiptoes, and then that way, if you couldn't hold yourself up any longer, if your legs started to give out, then it would choke you, and that's how the men in Texas died from that. And then whipping is something that was quite common. Guards were supposed to get permission before they whipped prisoners, but they rarely did that. Also by law, it was limited to 39 lashes for a prisoner, but they also didn't follow that. For example, one Black convict, a guy named John Henry, he was given 500 lashes and then shot and killed by guards. And they record this in their conduct ledgers for the prison. They don't try to hide it at all. They write down how many lashes they give people. A 17-year-old Black man that was in a plantation in Brazoria County for the prison, he was given 604 lashes. And one of the Kansas prisoners that gets transferred to Kansas, last name Lewis, he was whipped so severely that he died shortly after he arrived in Kansas. So there's lots and lots of reports of abuse and horrible things happening. And the guards, they kick them, they hit them with boards, sticks, rocks. All of these things are illegal punishments, but they do them nonetheless. And the most shocking punishment that they uncover is something called the horse. And this is a vertical post put in the ground, and then they put a pickaxe handle in the post. And then they take the prisoner and make them straddle the post, and then they pull their legs down and chain them to rings that are secured in the ground. And they keep them like that until they pass out. And this is actually a picture from the Spanish Inquisition that shows the horse. So we have prisons in Texas using the same kind of torture that the Spanish Inquisition used. So very, very brutal treatment of these prisoners. The investigation also uncovered shocking sexual abuse of female inmates, and women were not separated from men. They put them right in the prison with the men. Several women were pregnant when they were there. There's one episode where guards arrive to work and they find Ward and Dewey both in the courtyard, passed out drunk, partially unclothed, with women inmates in the same condition. So if you were a female convict and you refused their advances, then you were punished. I'm going to show you a picture. This is the front of the Huntsville prison at the walls. And then next to that is another picture, and I've tried to kind of overlap them so you could see how close. That's A.J. Ward's house. He lived right next to the prison. And Dewey actually had apartments inside the prison. So they were there all the time and easy access to female convicts. People up in Huntsville referred to this as the penitentiary whorehouse at the time, because they were shocked by what was going on up there. It's so bad, though, with Ward and Dewey. 1876 records show that about 300 convicts, which is about 17%, had escaped. The death rate was high. 109 people had died from disease, mostly malaria, but there's also measles, smallpox, pneumonia. Guards killed 28 convicts. And even more troubling, 182 were unaccounted for. They're just missing. They don't know where they are or what happened to them. So the Texas legislature says, all right, enough is enough. We're going to end Ward and Dewey's lease. So that's in 1876, but they don't want to give up the lease. They're going to find new people to lease the prison. And that's going to be Cunningham and Ellis. So they get a lease through 1883. It's Edward Cunningham and Little Barry Ellis. There's Edward Cunningham. We don't have a picture of Little Barry Ellis, but they formed a partnership in 1875 in anticipation of getting the lease, and they purchased several thousand acres of land in Fort Bend, County and Brazoria County. And using convict labor, they are going to create one of the largest sugar plantations in the country. And that, of course, will later become the Imperial Sugar Company in Sugar Land, Texas. By 1880, Cunningham and Ellis are working over 1,000 convicts on their own plantations, and they subleased out a little over 1,100 to other area planters. People that were leasing convicts would pay $3.01 per convict per month. And so Cunningham and Ellis, that lease is bringing in a lot of money to the state treasury. They averaged a little over $73,000 a year. And they leased convicts all across what was called the Sugar Bowl counties. So Fort Bend, Wharton, Matagorda, Brazoria. The prison system provided the guards, but because they're so spread out, there's very little inspection, and so abuses were rampant. And so even though the new lease is bringing in a lot of money, there are problems. So for example, prison records show that between 1878 and 1880, 256 convicts died from disease and abuse, and there were 366 escapes. So as we get closer to the end of the Cunningham-Ellis lease, the state decides that instead of finding a new private company to lease convicts, that they're going to do it themselves. They want to cut out the middleman because Cunningham and Ellis were making so much money. And so the state's like, well, why don't we just lease the convicts and we can make that money instead? So that's what they're going to do. So once they take the Cunningham-Ellis lease away, those two men still have that land and they're still growing sugar. And so they begin leasing convicts from the state themselves. And that's where the Ellis Camp 1, where the remains of the Sugar Land 95 are uncovered. So that, in 2018, they find those remains on the site of the Reese Technical Center building. This is a map that just shows the cemetery and where those remains were at. So they have 94 men and 1 woman that they found remains of. And we can talk more about that in the question period if you want to know more about what's going on specifically with that. So while the state is leasing out large numbers of convicts, they have a lot of convicts that they actually can't lease because they're ill, they're disabled, but the state wants to make money on them as well. So they start purchasing prison farms to operate themselves. The first one was up actually near Huntsville. It was called the Wind Farm. That was in 1884. And it's specifically for prisoners that had tuberculosis. And even sick prisoners were making money. So the state says, let's buy some more. And so they are going to buy some land here in Fort Bend County. And they're going to work prisoners that were graded as second class, meaning that they could not lease them out. And that's going to be Harlem Prison Farm. And that's actually where the Jester Prison Farm is today, prison unit is today. And it's actually right across from Pecan Grove, which is where I live, and how I got interested in this topic to begin with. So Harlem, Jester today, right there. So the state purchases this land for Harlem in 1886. And this is the start of jail prison farming. It had been a slave plantation growing cotton and sugarcane before, owned by the Lum family. And they start working, first they have 75 convicts on it. They want to make a profit off of them, and they make a lot of money on them. This is just, you can see how quickly it starts making a lot of money for the state. A little over $10,000 and then up to $167,000 by 1890. They're making so much money at Harlem that it's enough to fund almost the entire prison system. So they're like, we're on to something, we're going to keep doing this. And it's also going to give them an opportunity as they start to phase out leasing, that they have a place to work convicts where they can still profit from them. And that's what this is about. It's about making money for the state. And so they're going to purchase a second farm in 1899 that is in Brazoria County, Clemens Farm. That's another big one. But we're coming into, as we get to the turn of the century, right? This is the heart of what's called the Progressive Era. And this is about reforms in all parts of there are people working on child labor and anything and everything that they can think of, and prison reform is part of it. And so we will have a lot of focus on ending convict leasing in Texas. So we see two major prison investigations, one in 1902 and one in 1910, that are going to uncover so much abuse that it will eventually lead to the end of leasing in 1912. So this is from the 1902 investigation. The investigating committee declared that the lease system was a disgrace and that it should be abolished. And they said, and this is a quote, "As a rule, the life of a convict is not as valuable as that of a dog. As evidence thereof, we can find that the average life of a convict is 7 years. When men are shot down like dogs and are worked until they drop dead under the system, the people of Texas cannot hope to escape the responsibility of these wrongs. The existing methods are harsh, cruel, inhumane, and unworthy of an enlightened people." So they see that this is wrong. They're like, we need to do something about it. Takes them a while, but at least they're moving in the right direction. In 1908, the state is going to purchase the 5,200-acre Imperial Farm from Cunningham and Ellis. So you're like, okay, why would Cunningham and Ellis sell their land? Well, they know that convict leasing is going to come to an end, and they know that they will not be able to find adequate labor to work their sugar plantations once that happens. So they decide it's better to sell that land to the state, let the state prisoners grow the sugar cane, and then they would buy the sugar cane from the state and process it at their sugar mill. So just in case you don't know, Imperial Farm is close. It's right there off of 90 and Highway 6. It's called Central Prison now. So even under state control, there are reports of abuse. Prison officials firmly believed that the only way to handle convicts was by whipping them. From one investigation, a guard said, and this is another quote, he said that convicts are ignorant and vicious. And he said, "I do not think that you could control Black convicts without a strap. God made a Negro like a dog. Treat him good and he will rear up and put his feet on your clean shirt. No, sir, I don't think you need to treat a Negro mean, but when he misbehaves himself, he has to be whipped." End quote. So that attitude is prevalent throughout the prison system. But the governor of Texas at the time, Oscar Colquitt, there he is, he does not agree with the use of the whip, or also called the bat. And so he said that he wants it to end. So in 1912, they're going to end the use of the whip. Colquitt said in a speech, this is a quote from him, "Before the legislative investigation, the severest brutalities were practiced in the handling and management of prisoners. They were whipped with a leather strap 5 feet long, 3 inches wide, and half an inch thick upon their naked backs. And as long as I am governor of the state, the bat shall not be used again." And this is an image of the bat. This is actually up in the prison museum in Huntsville. And it's a giant leather strap that is shaped kind of like a baseball bat, which is why they called it a bat. And that's what they regularly use to beat prisoners. So they're going to abolish the use of the bat, and they're going to turn to other forms of punishment. The chains, putting people in chains or in the dark cell. It will lead to an almost immediate decrease in productivity on the farms, but it also has some unforeseen, really tragic consequences, particularly at Harlem Farm. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happens there. And this is going to be in 1913 when it takes place. So the manager at Harlem is a guy named Captain Calvin Blakely. And he complained, quote, that good work cannot be obtained from convicts under the new law if they don't want to work, which most of them do not. Big surprise, right? And so here's some images. If you know anything about Fort Bend history or Richmond history, there's Calvin Blakely as a younger man on a baseball team. And then the picture on the right is his son. The little boy on the left is Blakely's son. Blakely was married to Kate Wessendorf, who's part of the Wessendorf family that is, quite big in Fort Bend County. So at Harlem, productivity dropped by about half, and they're getting a lot of pressure to increase that production. Blakely said that the problem was that they had what he called too many city Negroes, meaning that they were young men that didn't know how to pick cotton already. So September 5th of 1913, prison officials accused a group of convicts at Harlem of picking too slowly and being insubordinate, and they asked for permission to punish them. So on September the 6th, they put 12 convicts, they were all young black men, inside the dark cell. It was designed to hold 4 people, and they put 12 people in. And by the next morning, 8 of those young men were dead from suffocation and heat stroke. And even though prison officials, the physician reported that the dark cell, they said it didn't have adequate ventilation. A month earlier, there was a inspection. They hadn't fixed anything. And we all know that Texas can be really hot in September, and the temperature inside the box was well over 110 degrees. There were only 4 air holes, each about the size of a quarter, that were fitted to a pipe in the floor of the cell. But all but one was plugged with dirt and debris. Before midnight, one of the prisoners, a young man named Carlton Vance, he was 17, he began to have convulsions. And when he started to convulse, convicts started yelling for help. The Sergeant Wheeler, told the guards to ignore the yelling. When they finally opened the door at 5:30 the next morning, 4 survivors stumbled out. The 8 dead men ranged in ages from 17 to 19. And all but one was serving between a 2 and 3 year sentence for petty theft or for violating the local option law, which was drinking alcohol, basically. So 3 guards were charged with 8 counts of manslaughter, but they were very quickly exonerated. They had an inquest panel. They said that they were following standard procedure, and they were all exonerated. And this story, it resonates with me today, considering that we just had the trial and conviction of the policeman that killed George Floyd. So it resonates with me today. Governor Colquitt was worried that this tragedy would actually cause the legislature to allow the return of the whip as punishment, but it did not. So the next administration is going to be Governor James Ferguson, and he is going to purchase more state farms because he really thinks that that's the way to go. And so the lease ends, and the inmate population in each state-owned farm then is going to increase. It will lead to some problems. There are actually a lot of escapes from those prison farms. The Imperial Farm, which will soon be changed to Central Prison Farm, they have several dangerous white convicts that attack guards and escape. In 1915, 2 of the escapees actually killed a citizen in Fort Bend County and robbed them. And so they have tracking dogs at Central, and I'm just going to show you a couple of pictures of this is Mr. Holland, and he's training the tracking dogs. And while they look cute, I mean, who doesn't like a cute dog? But they're used to actually track people that are escaping. And this is a training session with the dogs. They're trying to teach them how to track. At the Central Prison, and I got to visit it shortly after it closed in 2012. There's another picture of the dogs. This is the dog cemetery that's out there. They buried all of the dogs. They actually treated them and put better markers for the dogs than they did for the prisoners because their little markers are still standing. Another farm in Fort Bend County, 1918, Governor at the time is Governor Hobby. It's 6,000 acres. It's Blue Ridge Farm, which is all, in Fort Bend County. They bought that from Bassett Blakely. He was a cousin of T.C. Blakely from Harlem. So this shows where the Blakely farm was, and that's going to be the Blue Ridge Farm later. And the prison system, when they bought Blue Ridge, now they're up to about 81,000 acres of land, farmland across Fort Bend, Brazoria, Matagorda, Wharton counties. But really by the mid-1920s, citizens, particularly in Fort Bend County, are starting to complain about those prison farms. They're saying, look, they're taking up valuable land and they're not making any money for the county. So thousands of acres of this good farmland, developers want to buy it. And the prison, because it's a state entity, doesn't pay any taxes to the county for that land. And they're saying, well, if we could get private people to buy this land, then they would be paying county taxes. And so there's a lot of pushback from political officials against the prison farms, and there are a lot of escapes. 1928, there were almost 300 escaped convicts on the prison farms. So the prison board decides to change the policy, and they're going to stop concentrating on cash crops like cotton and sugarcane, and then they're going to try to raise just food for the prison. And by focusing on growing and canning vegetables, raising chickens, that sort of thing, they're going to try and provide food for other state institutions as well. But then, of course, we have the stock market crash and the Great Depression, and the prison is going to not be much of a concern to the state at the time. So I'm going to stop here so that if you have some questions that we can answer those. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And then if anybody has questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
I have one.
Yes.
These names that you are mentioning sound so familiar. I used to live in New Territory in the Robinson's Landing subdivision. So it's coming to me that the names of the streets are named after these individuals.
Yeah. Every time I go by
the administration.
Yeah. When I go by Cunningham, it's like Cunningham Creek Boulevard and Ellis.
Blakely Bend. Yes.
I think what happens is when developers come in and start putting in a neighborhood like New Territory, they look to see in the deed records who used to own the land, and they don't do the research or think about what the implication of those names are. And so they put these two, what I think are pretty horrible people, put their names on streets in that neighborhood. So yeah. So I guess that developers should all hire historians to do some research ahead of time.
I agree.
Anybody else have a question? Do y'all want me to talk a little bit about what's going on with the Sugarland 95 right now, or? I guess I just will, because I know that people usually want to know what's happening with that. So they found the remains in 2018. The school was, they were going to build a wing of the school over what turns out to be the cemetery. And they uncover human remains, and so they stop. And then further investigation, and they uncover all 95 sets of remains. And so they actually decided not to build that wing of the school. They continued building the rest of the school, but not the part that would have gone over the cemetery. And then they have reinterred all of them back where they were originally. So that map I showed earlier was where the graves were, and they put them back in the same spot. They did get permission from the Texas Historical Commission to take extractive DNA, mostly from molars. And that is being housed at a lab in Connecticut right now that has offered to do the DNA testing. It's like very expensive. They've gotten a grant to do some of it, but the archaeologist is housed up there in Connecticut, and so she's working on it. And they're trying to get funding to do that. So there is an effort underway by Fort Bend ISD to raise money for a memorial and a museum connected to the Sugarland 95. They have genealogists that are working on identifying the people that were at the camp at that time. And then once they have names, then they can start kind of tracing forward, trying to find descendants. And then once they have the DNA testing, which is a long process, it's not like on CSI where it happens overnight, right? It's going to take a long time. And then they can maybe possibly have descendants to match to that DNA and try and find them. And they have provisions in place so that if a descendant wants to reclaim the remains, that they can do that. So they have them all in marked coffins and marked and numbered and reinterred, but that they can give them to family members if they want. So that's kind of where they're at now. So if anybody has a question, I will be happy to answer it.
So these prisoners, were they segregated by race, or were they just all put in one prison unit?
They are all segregated by race. It's usually white convicts were kept inside the walls at Huntsville and working in things like the textile mill or the furniture factory. And then the black convicts were sent to the outside farms. So they were either leased out or to the outside farms. And then Blue Ridge is actually going to be mostly for Hispanic prisoners once they purchase that farm. The only white convicts that were leased out, they did lease some out to railroad camps and then also to coal mines out in Robertson County were mostly white convicts. But all of the farm labor was done by black convicts. You might find some white convicts on the farm, but they were usually doing more skilled labor like brick making or operating the sugar kettles, that sort of thing. So there were occasionally prisoners at those farms, but they are definitely segregated, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So question was, where is the exact location of hell on the Brazos? So yeah, that is, they referred to that as the Sugarland, the Imperial Farm through their central prison now. They called that hell on the Brazos. So that would have been Cunningham and Ellis's personal property that they used convicts on. And they used, also they had free labor there. So there were some free black people, not convicts, that worked on those sugar plantations as well, but mostly it's convict labor. Let's see.
Is there any record of what the total deaths were of prisoners through the history of the Texas lease system?
There are, it's not something that I've ever actually gone through and totaled up, but they have records, and how accurate they are is a little, you know, they write down everybody in the conduct registers, and they write down when they die. And that's how the genealogists are finding a lot of the Sugarland 95. It's something that I've never actually gone through and totaled up. I mean, it's thousands of people. They have cemeteries. The one that they found here with 95 people is just one of, I mean, there were dozens of farm camps around here.
Yeah.
I know that there's a cemetery that I've seen discussed in the records that's out in where would be Jester 4 now, I think, but they have no idea where it's at. You know, when they bury people, usually the families couldn't afford to reclaim the remains, and the state wouldn't send it back. And so they just buried them with a wooden marker with their convict number on it. And then it gets neglected and the wooden marker disappears, and then it gets grown over, and they have no idea where they're at. And,
wow.
You know, there was suspicion that there was a cemetery somewhere in the vicinity of where they found the Sugarland 95. They didn't know exactly where it was. And it was just pure chance that the school was put there and that they found them. But I guarantee you, know, I live out here in Pecan Grove, and think there's probably a cemetery buried under this subdivision somewhere, you know, that just, they're all over the place and we don't know where they're at, which is really sad.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, let's see. I see a question is Blue Ridge on McCard Road. Blue Ridge is right. It's like across the street from 90 and Highway 6, kind of in that, like if you're going down past where the Reese Center is now, it was in that area. But I don't know where McCard Road is, so I don't know if that's where it's at or not. I should go out and drive around sometime and just try and find where everything actually was, where it is in location today. So when they found the Sugar Land 95 and they kept telling me where it was and, you know, how to find it, I was like, what? You know, so I would drive down the road and look to see if I could see where they were working to locate it. Because, you know, you see a map and it doesn't necessarily translate into my head exactly where it is. Okay, well, I'll give you guys my email if anybody has any other questions they want to ask me. It's just Theresa Jach at hccs.edu, and I'll put it in the chat. So if you think of something that you want to ask me, I'll be happy to try and answer it for you. I don't have all the answers, but I will try to answer any questions that you do have. And, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on with the Sugar Land 95. So if you are interested in keeping track of it, then you can look at Fort Bend ISD's website. They have a lot of stuff. The Convict Leasing Labor Project is doing a lot of work with that as well. They're trying to make sure that people hear about this and know what's happening. So they are trying to carry on that legacy and make sure people know what's going on with all of the convict lease and labor that really built this this community. The wealth of this community is built on the backs of those people that were forced to work here in Fort Bend County. So yeah. And this last question that came in, so Hell on the Brazos wasn't camp. So it's not specifically where the Sugar Land 95 were. It was more in general what people referred to all of the people that were working for Imperial Sugar, for Cunningham and Ellis. It wasn't called Imperial then. And they referred to that whole area, and it was huge, and there were thousands of people working there. And that's what they called the hellhole on the Brazos, were people that were forced to work for Cunningham and Ellis. Yeah, because it's not. So it wasn't just that one specific camp, because that Ellis camp, there were multiple camps. So they had them divided up with a camp manager. And so they were, like at Harlem, there were 4 camps just at that one prison farm. So they divide them up. But hellhole on the Brazos kind of refers to the whole area.
Dr. Jazz, got one more question for you. Do you know
Sure.
how much money the state made over the course of their prison farm?
Oh my gosh. So once the state starts leasing prisoners, it's several $1 million over the course of the time that and I mean, that's back in 1900 money, you know, at the turn of the century. Just Harlem prison is bringing in $200,000-$300,000 a year for them. So leasing out convicts, and it's really hard to calculate exactly what it would have been, because you have to take into account when they're leasing out convicts, they also don't have the same expenses when Cunningham and Ellis had it, because they had to pay for some of the operating expense. So there's money that they don't have to pay in that can help their bottom line. But yeah, the prison is making money for them, definitely.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, seems like that's everybody.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well,
All right.
thanks
Well,
again,
Dr. Jacks,
everybody,
thank you very
for
much.
coming. Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for coming and listening, everyone.